Geoff Richards lives in Auckland in New Zealand and for many years has been a member of the Christadelphian Church or ecclesia at Waitakere. Geoff is a physician who specialises in substance abuse and addiction, and he joins Wilderness Conversations. Geoff, welcome to Wilderness Conversations. I'd like to get some general information from you on substance addiction and dependence, and then, if we can, have a little bit of a look at a biblical perspective. But first, I'm really interested to hear a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And it's good to have a talk about something I'm passionate about. So most of your listeners don't know me, so let me... where do we start? So I was born and bred a Christadelphian Canterbury ecclesia, Melbourne, and I've got an elderly mother and some siblings still in Melbourne. I like to think that I fully explored the options of Christadelphianism, Christianity, and sought it out. But of course, I had that blessing that you did, for example, that we had parents who led us in that pathway. The reason I say it like that is, of course, sometimes people say, oh, you just got spoon-fed everything from a young life and you've just, followed like sheep. But I like to think that, yes, we were very blessed with our upbringings, but we've, I think, had the insight that it's necessary to find out for yourself whether or not it's of interest,
for sure,
and whether it's the truth. So I went to Monash University shortly after I got baptised as a youngster, and then we are now seated in central Auckland, having immigrated here 10 years ago this year. So we've been in Auckland for 10 years. And I've got 2 kids and a lovely wife. And what else can I say about Auckland? We're privileged to have some fantastic ecclesias here in the city, and also you may have a harbour in Sydney, but don't forget we've got 2 harbours. I just point.
Excellent. What took you to Auckland?
So Deborah, my wife, is a Christchurch girl, and we spent our younger married years in Melbourne, but she's got a lovely family here. No one left in Christchurch. They've all moved, like the rest of the nation, moved northward. We're
going to offend all of the people in Christchurch, you realise that?
Yes, it's true. So we're here in Auckland, and back in Melbourne, I had 300 heroin-using patients under my care. And when we immigrated here, yes, I do a little bit of general practice, but I also thought, well, how am I going to use my skills of managing opiate dependence and related drug addiction? So I've joined a couple of services here. So right now, my current status is I run a public hospital clinic devoted to opiate dependence. I also provide services for an 11-bed inpatient detoxification unit, do a bit of teaching. And I guess, Steve, it's relevant to point out for this discussion that my particular interest is injecting hard drugs like opiates and methamphetamine.
How did you get into that? I assume you were a general practitioner initially?
Background as a generalist, yeah. Well, I've always been interested in drugs, but there was an opportunity at one of the Monash University teaching hospitals back in Melbourne, and because I was interested in it, I accepted a position there and then just became educated in such things. And You might say, well, it's a pretty tough discipline, a pretty tough specialty, but just turn things around a bit. Do you know how many people you need to treat with their blood pressure and cholesterol and lifestyle problems to save a life, compared to if you can get an individual who is doing dangerous things with drugs, and if you can provide, they need to make the decision themselves, but if you can provide a pathway to assist them, then you can create a whole amount of difference to that individual and therefore society as a whole quite readily. So it is actually stereotypically a rewarding job.
Well, we're probably jumping the gun a little bit here, but I definitely have one of the questions was, how often and how realistic is this sort of treatment? Do you get results?
Absolutely, yeah, without doubt. And let's not compare it to general medicine too much. But how often can we reduce someone's blood pressure or cholesterol in the general community? There's a striking amount of similarity that may not be apparent, such as an individual needs to seek that treatment to actually make a difference. So, yeah, there's quite a lot of analogy there, but as you say, we're jumping the gun a bit. One of the things I like to point out up front is that drugs are an integral part of our society, like it or not. And going back historically, you look at the ancient Egyptians, thousands of years BC, they were using opiates. You go to the Pacific Islands and you'll find kava. You go to Vietnam and you'll see people with black teeth because they chew betel nut. In the Amazon jungle, you'll find people who ingest coca leaves with a little bit of alkaline in this, a wad of alkaline in their gums. So the coca plus the alkaline makes cocaine. So it's a very, very universal phenomenon historically and around the world. And I think that's, like it or not, it's important to point that out. And once again, when we're talking to our brothers and sisters, the Christadelphian community is not immune to the exposure of every aspect of our society around us, whether it be our clothing style and our behaviour in different ways, or whether it being our drug use. We're not immune to it. Fortunately, I'll say in the same breath, we are insulated from a large number of social ills. For example, we have a lot less imprisonment in our own fellowships than the general community. We would see a lot less physical abuse, a lot of the abuses in childhood, a lot of the social problems we are insulated from, and we pray that will continue to be one of the blessings of our fellowship. So, yeah, we are insulated, and you may say, hey, I don't even know a single person in our fellowship who has injected drugs. I don't know anyone who has used methamphetamine. So while that's my principal interest, you might want to pull me back into line and say, well, hold on, let's talk about the more socially available and the more widespread drugs to actually be a little bit relevant.
I was going to say something like that. I read in the Australian government has a really good website, and I was just having a look around that before, and it says that 1 in 20 Australians has an addiction or a substance abuse problem, which is 5%. I've got to say, that really surprised me.
Yeah.
To see that it was so prevalent.
Yeah. And please don't come to me for statistics, because I'm a clinician. I'm not I treat people. I don't know the graphs and the numbers. But when you start throwing around those numbers, It's just insane. You know, you look at Australia's numbers are similar to New Zealand numbers. You know, when you look at the percentage of people who ever in their life have injected drugs, please don't quote me because I haven't researched these numbers, but it's something like 1% of the entire Australian population has injected drugs. Well, you know, you take 100 people, 100 of your friends. My goodness, I wouldn't have expected there to be even one of them who have injected drugs, but that's the case. When we then get on to, you know, who have problematic use of alcohol or who regularly use cannabis, then those numbers go through the roof.
Can we start with a few of the terms? Because
very, very good.
There are differences between terms which I don't fully understand. For example, substance abuse, addiction, and dependence. What would... is there a difference between, for example, addiction and dependence?
Some of the words are used a little bit loosely. There are very precise definitions. So where do we go? If you want a really detailed definition of addiction, it is a biopsychosocial disorder characterised by persistent use of substances despite substantial harm and adverse consequences. Phew. Okay, that's one heck of a definition. Let's just break it down. Biopsychosocial, so everything we can break down to biological, meaning the physical and the medical side of things, the psychological and the social aspects, but it is a disorder. So an addiction is a disorder affecting those three facets, and it's characterised by persistent use of substances. Now, that's an important one because there may be someone who has drunk too much alcohol, or there may be someone who has experimented with drugs, but that's obviously not the meaning of the word addiction. And then we come into despite substantial harm or adverse consequences. So let me just go back a step to a substance dependence. So if we're dependent, that means there's a physical or psychological tolerance requiring an increasing amount of use of the substance to have a smaller or a similar effect. And also a withdrawal phenomenon when stopping using the drug. Now, we're getting a bit technical here, but a drug dependence is, think of that as step number one. And I might see a little old lady who's dependent on Valium, which is just a sedative medication, and she's can be fully dependent on it. Or I might see a young adult who's dependent on sleeping tablets. A good way of thinking of it from a doctor's point of view is when they cross the line and then they show some addictive behaviours, that's when they might start to lie about how much they use. Or they might start to, and this is what I see every day, they might start to lose the prescription that I wrote for them last month and seek another prescription a bit earlier. And when you start to get into this deceitful or the problematic things, or when they start to get drink driving offences or criminality or loss of loved ones, injuries, marriage breakups, relationship dysfunction, those sorts of things. That's when we're moving from a substance dependence into the addiction, the addictive. We make a distinction there. People are doing themselves more trouble, more harm when they get into the addictive side of things. The DSM-5, which is the guidebook that psychiatrists use, the modern buzzword is to call it a substance use disorder. So that fully medicalises it. So it's a disorder, and it's a substance use disorder. Please, Stephen, don't use the term alcohol and drug problems. Alcohol and drug. That's a very important distinction to make, or important definition to include, that alcohol is a drug and it is the second most lethal drug in our society following tobacco. So please don't in any way spare alcohol from considering it as a drug. Alcohol 100% is a drug. A better term, if you're going to use something like that, would be to say alcohol and other drugs. And sometimes we see specialists who practice in AOD, alcohol and other drugs. Have I made myself clear? Alcohol is the number 2 killer.
Absolutely clear. So when we talk about alcohol and other drugs, tobacco being one of them, I noticed also on the same website previously mentioned that 1 in 10 Australians aged 14 and over smoke every day. Again, I was surprised. But more than that, tobacco contributes or causes more than 9% of the burden of disease in Australia.
Absolutely.
That's an extraordinary number, 9%. So if you think that the cost of healthcare in Australia, 9% of that is a result of tobacco.
Yeah. And that brings us back to our own communities a little bit more, because, goodness me, I want to say a few words particularly about youth. Now, when we're talking about substance use issues, this is not a young person's discipline because it affects everyone. And, you know, I'm sure you would have peers and be aware of people of all age groups. This is not just a young person subject. So with regard to young people, Steve, I really want to be clear that discussing substance abuse is not a young people's topic. It affects everyone. Mm-hmm. But having said that, with regard to young people, part of youth is risk-taking behaviours. Take your typical teenager. Risk-taking behaviours might be jumping off the top diving board at the swimming pool. It might be driving a car too fast. It might be staying up all night. You know, it depends on what level. Are we talking about 13-year-olds or are we talking about, 21-year-olds? Different things. And part of the risk-taking behaviour of young people can be substance experimentation with. It might be, I'm not talking specifically about Christadelphian or non-Christadelphians, but it might be experimenting with a cigarette at school, or a drink, or a lot of drinks, or cannabis, and the list goes on. Okay, so experimenting in the same way as what's it like to, get behind the wheel of the car and drive fast at night on wet roads and, and suffer the consequences. In the same way as sometimes young people, Christadelphian or otherwise, will experience drunkenness or experience an injury or a very bad headache the next day. So I'm jumping around here, I know, but one of the really concerning things is that with something like cannabis, if we're talking about young people, there's a lot of things we don't know about cannabis, but one thing we know very clearly is that the developing brain does not handle cannabis well. So when we hear about 13, 15, 17-year-olds using cannabis, we know that the younger end of the spectrum are really putting their developing brain at risk in terms of their ability to lay down neurons, get a good intelligent brain to take them through their young adult years. So that is of real concern.
Does that apply to alcohol and tobacco as well, or to a lesser extent? But
I'm actually quoting cannabis specifically because we know about that. Other drugs certainly doesn't. I don't believe there's anything clear relating to tobacco and alcohol. Not my department. I won't try and comment about that specifically. But in terms of, I guess we're now talking about the harms of drugs, okay? So at the hard end of drugs, when I see people injecting drugs, they're highly at risk of dying. They're at risk of picking up very nasty viruses. And we're not just talking about HIV, we're talking about hepatitis C, hepatitis B, other bacterial infections. And we see people, my own patients, we see them getting bacterial diseases that go to their heart and their brain and their bones, and they die. So at that pointy end of the spectrum, I see patients who die who are under my care. Now, down at the more common end of the spectrum, we know about the level of risk. And yes, I've seen people get into terrible trouble with cannabis. And the most acute, the most worrying, the most irreversible, and the most serious thing we see with cannabis is when people develop psychosis. So they develop a schizophrenia-like syndrome, and that is not reversible. That's something that they can set themselves up with, and the risk factors relating to that, and who gets it and who doesn't, is poorly understood. Which is medical speak. When you ever hear doctors say that's poorly understood, that means no one's got any idea.
Right.
I guess young people will do these things. Now, let's bring it back to within our own families and ecclesias. How do we try and limit young people from using drugs in the first place? Well, you know, we've got plenty of scriptural comments about good company versus bad company. We read in the scriptures that good company is a good thing, and mixing with people or trying to be moulded by the world around us, conforming to the world is a problem. But just in terms of the real practicalities, you know, we're talking about young people here. Keep them busy, Steve.
Right.
Having their music lessons, or get them doing their soccer training, or keep them busy within the ecclesia. Keep them busy with doing things, because when you've got kids with time on their hands, then, you know, human beings, young people, teenagers are social animals. They're animals. They're wanting to socialise, and they'll socialise with whoever is available to them. Now, I don't think you asked me my advice on this subject, but I've just given it.
I appreciate your advice. Can we talk about alcohol? And I know you said it's not your area of expertise, but it seems to me that it's probably one of the most commonly available and commonly accepted, my words, of the drugs.
Yeah. So,
what is your experience?
So tobacco, I mean, you might say, oh, goodness me, you see the smokers lining up outside the government buildings, or, you know, standing outside cafes and restaurants because the smokers aren't allowed to be anywhere. But we still consider tobacco and alcohol as to being the socially sanctioned drugs. In other words, it's out there. And you would think nothing if you saw someone hanging a cigarette out of the driver's window of a car, or having a drink, you know, at a cafe or a public place. Whereas you're not going to see someone injecting a drug, or most commonly using a bong in a public place in downtown Sydney. So that brings a problem because these drugs are hugely available. We've moved on from young people now. We've moved on to everyone. Massively available, socially sanctioned drugs. And yeah, sure, we're not allowed to see tobacco sponsorship of sport. We saw that go when we were kids. You know, those days are well and truly over. To see the Marlboro Man or the alcohol companies,
the Benson and Hedges One Day series.
All of that, yeah. So a lot of that has been cut back, but they still manage to advertise using as many techniques as they can, of course. I told you I'm not going to talk statistics and graphs. But if we take tobacco as the biggest killer, and we take alcohol without doubt as being the next biggest killer. But let's just, there is another graph that I could allude to, which looks at social harms. That's not death, that's social harms. And alcohol screams to the top of the list there. Why? Because of the social harms of alcohol. And that talks about drink driving. It talks about marital stuff. It talks about all of the non-lethal medical stuff. And we're talking about, I could show you a picture, Steve, of the organs of the body that are affected by alcohol. Well, it's pretty easy because it's nearly all of them.
Right.
People think, oh, the liver. Oh, yeah, there's the brain as well.
Right.
Yeah, but it goes on. You know, it affects the bones. It affects the kidneys. It affects the pancreas. Alcohol affects muscle. It affects every organ of the body in an adverse way. So there's the medical, but there's a huge impact on social. And let's take it down to we've got a party or a function or a gathering where people are drinking just that little bit too much alcohol. And words can get said. I'm thinking of the book of James here all of a sudden. The tongue.
Mm-hmm.
Words can get said, and you can't retract some things that are said publicly or from mouth to mouth, from person to person, and severe damage. And let's face it, our communities are small communities. So if something gets said, if there's some gossip or some harsh words, then those words can never be retracted. So I've gone from drink driving offences, car accidents and national harms through to the minor interpersonal things, the little indiscretions, the things that happen or are said. Where do we start? Where do we stop? What's a safe level of alcohol? For some people, it's zero. You know, some people don't do well with alcohol at all, and whereas other people, I think it's good at this point to think about Jesus. So we know Jesus, first miracle, Cana, water into wine. So Jesus was absolutely part of the safe drinking, Last Supper, wine. It's there in the scriptures. I think it's very appropriate to talk about Jesus in terms of alcohol. There's great personal benefit in having no alcohol at all, but there's no scriptural justification, in my opinion. We're getting opinionated now, but there's no scriptural justification when we've got those examples from Christ himself. I think Christadelphians love pulling out what Paul said to Timothy about a little wine for your stomach's sake. Well, the physiology is not good there. Alcohol is particularly bad for the stomach. Gastritis, peptic ulceration, people reaching for their Gaviscons. So I don't mean that Paul was wrong, but I think the sentiment that alcohol can be calming or enjoyable or good for the soul, I think that's what he was getting at. Please don't let any of your listeners go away, quote Paul, and say, that'll help my stomach, because it does not.
Well, it is clear that the wine is given as one of the blessings from God, but there's a pretty clear injunction that we should not overindulge, it seems.
I agree with that, and I'm just thinking ahead to Christ's example. So, what about the scriptures' take on addiction? Full stop. Okay. What about what the Bible says about addiction? What about what the Bible says about drugs of dependence? So it says nothing, because there were no drugs of dependence. I hear you say. Now, let's just drill down here a little bit. So the stereotype drug of dependence that is massively mentioned from Genesis through the entire scriptures is alcohol. There's plenty of examples. What I'd like to highlight is that, what did we say up front? We said you'll find Carver in the Pacific Islands, Scotch whisky, and, maybe it comes out of Scotland. You'll find drugs throughout the world. Well, what was the drug of choice? What was the drug mostly available from Old Testament to New Testament? Was alcohol.
I'm thinking of Noah after the flood as an example. And then the other one that comes to my mind is Aaron and his sons, well, the two sons of Aaron, after which God forbade the high priest to drink before service.
Yep, good. Yep, that's really good. And if you want some hard lines, just turn to Paul's writings about, it doesn't say don't drink alcohol, but it does forbid drunkenness. Okay? Now, what is drunkenness? It's an altered state of consciousness which opens up all of the acute risks of alcohol, whether it be falling over and breaking your wrist, loosening of the tongue, the physical harms, the list goes on. And Romans, Corinthians, you don't need me to quote chapter and verse. I think our audience knows. Ephesians, Galatians, each of those are fairly clear on drunkenness. But I wanted to come back to the example of Christ. And this does take a little bit of drilling down a little bit. But you remember on the cross, Jesus, and they do, between Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, they do use slightly different terms. But basically, if you harmonise the accounts, basically Jesus was thirsty, and one of the 7 sayings of Christ on the cross was,
"I thirst."
Yeah, absolutely. So he was given some sort of wine vinegar, and he drank it. But then I think it's Mark where it says he was offered, and the words are either gall or myrrh, right? I love my New International Version. And, of course, between Mark and Matthew, you will see different words there. But gall, that's nothing to do with the gallbladder, but gall was a mild Middle Eastern narcotic. It was a drug. So I would use the words gall or myrrh interchangeably. So a little bit of wine vinegar Jesus consumed.
So just to clarify, he was given 2 different substances. We can conflate them, I think, when we're reading the Gospels, but when read carefully, we see there are 2 different things going on here.
Yep, absolutely. We're talking the same language here. The Mark account says he refused it, but even Matthew is more clear. It says when he tasted it, he refused it. Now, I'm going to talk historically. I'm not talking from the scriptures. What happened was there were women at the time of crucifixions who would offer this mild narcotic to the poor souls who were going through what must be incredible pain. Now, a narcotic is a drug. This is not alcohol. We're going at the next level. It's not at the level of morphine, but it's certainly at the level of something which is a drug. Now, this is interpolating and extrapolating, I guess, a little bit on what's going on. But why would Jesus, if he's thirsty, put it to his lips and then refuse it? He knew what it was. It was a drug. What's the example from Jesus? What time in any human nature, in humankind since the beginning of time, what circumstance would someone deserve to have a little bit of pain-relieving, mind-numbing drug than Christ on the cross? Is there any more deserving person than that?
Certainly not.
But what did Christ do? He wanted to be 100% serving God with a lucid mind, and he wanted to set an example for us, perhaps, but absolutely he was not prepared to have that drug. So I've told you there's nothing in the scriptures about addiction. Well, there's absolutely plenty of guidance about alcohol, about drunkenness. The positive comment about alcohol is that Jesus consumed it. The very strong message I would take from that little cameo from Christ on the cross was Jesus could have mercifully numbed himself somewhat, and yet he declined it.
It's a fantastic example, isn't it? The other one that comes to my mind, and again, it's probably a bit of an extrapolation, but Paul's comments that our body is the temple of God.
Absolutely.
And being made in the image and likeness of God, we show due respect to God by caring for our bodies. Now, I suppose in some ways we all perhaps overindulge in different areas, and perhaps that's a fairly broad sort of a statement, but certainly taking on of drugs and tobacco certainly doesn't seem to be in keeping with that high ideal anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's 1 Corinthians 6, and we like to quote that our body is the temple of God. But Steve, just one more thing, whether you use my word, the whole vibe of the scriptures, or if we use a more traditional word, shall we say the golden thread of the scriptures, what's it about? It's about service. It's about discipleship. It does involve self-restraint. Think the fruit of the Spirit, right? All of those, that's my word, the vibe of the scriptures, the whole intent. Those first three, your homework, Steve, tonight, just reread Romans 12, first three verses. Don't be conformed.
Be transformed.
Okay, present your bodies. Oh, that ties in with what you just quoted. Your bodies are temples of God. Don't be conformed. Present your bodies. Verse 3, something about think with, what is it? Think with sober judgment. That's what my version says. Think with sober judgment. So there's plenty of generalities that I think God has given us intelligent brains that we can all put to work and draw conclusions. So the whole thread of the scriptures, and there is another word, and I've read that in 1 Peter more than 3 times. It may be a lot more than that. This concept of being watchful. All right, be alert. Be ready, be watchful, use your time. Now, what do my sedative drugs do? When I'm going to be in an outpatient clinic 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, what do my sedative drugs do to my patients? They make people unmotivated. They make people, what's the opposite of alert? Shall we say unalert? They're sluggish. They're sedated. They're not watchmen. They're not being ready. There is an opposite. I keep coming back to young people because I do spend time with Christadelphian young people. I don't know what your children have been like historically, but just take your stereotyped young person. One of the classic lines is, but what's wrong with blah, blah, blah? What's wrong with it? So young people are very good at turning things around and saying, well, what's wrong? And, of course, then, old boomer parents come through and say, but what's right with, well, that's a stalemate. You're not going to have a good discussion with young people. What's wrong with it? What's right with it? But I guess just to get the vibe of the scriptures, what are we all about? Sometimes I say to my cannabis patients who might also be using lots of other drugs. Now, this isn't you and me, but I might say, so how is your cannabis use problematic for you at present?
Mm-hmm.
And they say, it's not. I find it helps me sleep. I like it. Yeah, but they're not trying to lead an exemplary life in service to God. So, you know, maybe I've got a double, well, no, I don't maybe have it. I do have a double standard. You know, are you trying to follow the example of Christ? Christ didn't use drugs, and the apostles warn against drunkenness and therefore, by implication, all mind-altering substances. So, yeah, I've got a double standard. Are we trying to aim as high as we can? Now, that's not in any way forbidding the use of alcohol. Now, you were up front before when we were when I was just having a chit chat with you before, Steve, and I'll be up front with you now. I cannot see any role for inhaled substances. We've had a vote, a referendum 2 years ago in New Zealand. Shall we legalise cannabis? Will we go the way of Colorado and Canada? So we had this referendum. So one of the comments made about cannabis, wait for it, there's a bit of humour in this. I'll see if you see the humour. One of the comments was, oh, cannabis is not more harmful than tobacco. So that's an argument for legalising. Wait a minute. It's not more harmful than the nation's #1 killer.
It's a very low bar.
I laugh when I hear that comment. It's not worse than our nation's #1 killer. Well, that's good. Let's encourage people to use it because it's not that bad. Hey, tobacco and alcohol. Tobacco and cannabis. You stick to your Temple of God principle, and I can't see any role for it. Alcohol, however, we follow the. I'm not going on your podcast and pushing it down the throat of people, Steve. But I'm just making the comment. You know, as a community, if we're following the example of Christ, we can't be like the Christians of the bygone era and ban it. You know, we're a very specific community, and we can't ban an item like it. But we, you know, follow the example of avoiding drunkenness, absolutely. And speaking of the bar, you talked about the low bar of tobacco. In my own practicing career, we keep moving the bar lower in terms of how safe alcohol is. Is it 4 drinks a day? It's less than 4 drinks a day. Is it 2 drinks a day? And we keep on. Don't ask me to quote a number because we just keep moving that bar. So
meaning we're discovering all the time how harmful it can be.
Exactly. And, you know, when I see people having a few too many drinks, I know what's happening. They are losing brain cells in front of my eyes, and they're certainly losing liver cells as well. So I'm sorry, I am mixing some scientific facts with a whole bunch of opinions and interpretation of the scriptures. But you take...
Well, you can put in there your experience, which is worthwhile as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Steve. So we've got a mix of opinion and fact here, but I'm sure our listeners can sort of tease those things out, can't they?
Perhaps as we draw our conversation to a close, perhaps the most important question might be, what are some of the steps we can take, if we find ourselves or consider perhaps we are drinking too much, or if we have a dependence, what do we need to do?
Steve, it's very hard to even identify some of those things in ourselves. So I want to broaden that to what happens if it's our brother or sister or family member or loved one or something. And, of course, that's really hard because we might be able to see a glaringly obvious a fault in someone else. And, you know, we might see the large log in our brother's eye and we can't even see that speck in our own eye. So I guess it's I guess there's a couple of factors there in looking inwards and looking outwardly. Just a good subtle tip there for our brothers and sisters or our loved ones is one of the other features of a dependence on a substance. This is a really good medical buzzword. It's the narrowing of repertoire of activities. The narrowing of repertoire. So what I'm referring to is if more, and I guess you can apply this to yourself as well, but it's hard to see it in yourself. But if more and more of one's activities, and let's focus on alcohol, but it applies to all drugs, if more activities seem to centre around the use of that substance. So, for example, if it's a function, but it centres on there's always alcohol there. Or if you're always reaching for a drink. Or if, I can't really be bothered doing that, I think I'll just keep to myself or stay home. I used to do this social or recreational. I don't so much. No, I'll just, when you hear people narrowing their repertoire, it's like a music repertoire, but it's a repertoire of their social choices or activities. When that becomes a bit more restricted or narrowed, there's writing on the wall. There's a warning sign. So that's a very good thing to look out for. When we're looking at our brothers and sisters, in the same way as when tomorrow I see people who inject drugs in my clinic, starting point, absolutely non-judgmental. This is our opportunity to show love. It's our opportunity to show empathy and non-judgmental, because we don't know what our brothers and sisters have been through, what's in their makeup that has either driving them to do this, what's in their background that has triggered something. And remember, we're talking about subtleties in many cases, and within our fellowship, we're talking small baby steps towards too much alcohol. Okay, we're not talking in all cases about your stereotyped hard drug addict or alcoholic who is doing terrible things. We're talking about, in many cases, the milder things. So therefore, coming back to mild, how do we pick it up, or how do we deal with it ourselves? Well, when we're talking about ourselves, I guess identifying is one of the hardest parts. So it's listening out for cues, clues, and without even know, it's good to talk to our family, friends, trusted loved ones, etc. But without even doing that, there's no shortage of good assistance. You can Google, your top 3 words, and it will take you straight to a really good New Zealand, Australian website. Drink help, alcohol help, the Australian Drug Foundation. The list just goes on and on and on. And sometimes, you can actually draw benefit online with minimal involvement of other people. I'm confusing the situation. The best thing is to involve human beings, but we're a tight community. It's very hard sometimes to open up. So self-help and getting professional help within and without the community is a good starting point. Absolutely,
Geoff. Thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
You're a great interviewer, Stephen, because you let me ramble on. So good luck with that. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Geoff.